How's it going, people? I recently made a video on Skoda providing a cheap alternative to luxury cars that more consumers can get into, and though the reaction to that video was overwhelmingly positive, and thank you very much for that, one key point that was raised was that Skodas are just cheap VWs. And I'm sure if you're watching this video and are a long-term viewer of the channel, you probably know that Skoda falls under the VW group of brands, and probably have some awareness of the fact that many cars that fall into the VW group appear to be pretty similar. But how similar are they? Is it fair to say that cars that sit on the same platform are essentially the same? What are the differences between the offerings within different market segments for each of the brands that sit under the VW umbrella? In this video I'll go more in depth on the VW group and the differences between these brands and their cars. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, hit the like button as well if you enjoy this kind of content, and subscribe as well if you're new. But without further ado, let's get into the video. So there are two main areas I'd like to cover in this video to give you an understanding of whether these manufacturers essentially make the same cars. First, we'll cover the organisation structure and the strategy of VW Group. Then we'll go into the importance of platforms and sharing for the organisation too. So to understand how similar the brands are, we have to look at how the VW Group operates. VW owns more than 25 subsidiary companies across the automotive fields, from passenger cars to motorbikes to heavy goods vehicles and beyond. In terms of the brands that we consumers can buy, VW splits them out into three categories within the organisation: the volume brand group, which is VW passenger cars, SEAT, Skoda and VW commercial vehicles; the premium brand group, which is Audi, Lamborghini and Ducati; and the sport and luxury brands, which is Porsche, Bentley and Bugatti, although Bentley has now been moved to the premium brand group as of 2021. There is a fourth category, truck and bus, but that's for the Scania and MAN brands, which I doubt the majority of us would be buying. Each brand is managed by its own board of management, who focus on developing the brands and deploying business operations as they see fit. They do have to adhere to the targets and requirements that the VW Group gives to them where possible, but they still do get the autonomy around the group's strategy to build their brands on their own. There are some very important roles that are overseen from a group level rather than from a brand level though, which the group names strategic issues relating to products, technologies, investments, digital transformation, integrity and compliance, risk management, human resources and management issues. So the group still holds a lot of power over each brand. Some key components are also procured or developed by the group as well to some degree, including some of the technology the brands use and the powertrains. So to put it simply, VW Group sits as a strategic director above all the market segments, which are split into multiple brands. So theoretically, even VW, the car brand, sits on the same level as all the other brands below the group VW. But that's not all. I mentioned VW owns multiple other brands. Some of those are specifically in place to develop components, materials and technology to be shared across the brands, like the car software organization, which centralizes the development of car software across the many different brands, which is why the infotainment screens in a Skoda are very similar to those in a VW, for example. So immediately, before we've gone anywhere, we can see how each of these brands could have many similarities. The thing is, VW really needs to balance how much control it decides to take over its brands, because they can compete with each other to some degree, and though competition can be healthy, it can also cause friction if not managed well. Originally, the idea behind VW, SEAT and Skoda was that VW was the more premium but slightly more reserved brand, SEAT is the sportier and more emotive brand, and Skoda is the more budget, simple and basic brand. However, as time has gone by, these brand images have altered, with Skoda being so successful that it became the second most profitable brand in the group by 2017, and the prices of the cars have gone up to reflect a significant increase in quality. In comparison, though SEAT was doing well, it wasn't growing at Skoda's rate, hence VW Group made the strategic decision to take the brand even more upmarket to try to drive more revenue, which reflected in positive results in 2020. Don't forget also that different brands can have different images in different markets, so having all these different brands means that VW Group can target them all separately. The reason why I'm telling you all this is basically because it's so interesting that despite all three of these manufacturers falling under the same group, and despite people saying they all make basically the same cars, their performance as businesses is completely different, which I would argue reflects the fact that there is enough difference, at least in the way that we perceive the cars from each of these manufacturers, if not enough difference physically. And when I talk about physical differences, as someone who's driven both old and new cars from VW, SEAT, Skoda and Audi, it is easy to see why people say they're all the same. But this has come first of all as a result of the shared providers of components and technology as I mentioned, and also from VW's commitment to platform-based cars that sit within their relevant market segments. In the 1970s, the VW Group started to develop a set of platforms that their cars would share, which would enable them to very easily create multiple cars for multiple segments and brand them differently. With their scale, they could also choose to share components on these platforms too, making life easier and cheaper for the group. A good example of this is the original VW Polo and the Audi 50, both of which sat on the A01 platform back in 1974. The Polo was effectively a rebadged Audi 50 with some different engine options and a cheaper price tag. This almost acted like an experiment for VW Group to see whether the more premium name of Audi would attract enough attention or whether it was a waste of time compared to the Polo. In the end, the Polo massively outperformed the Audi, and VW Group cancelled making super minis for the Audi brand all the way until the A2 in 1999. What I'm trying to say is, this platform gave VW Group some flexibility above and beyond what other brands without platforms had. They could experiment, test and produce multiple different cars on the same platform with different badges and see how they perform with limited spend, as they're not designing a brand new car every time. Funnily enough, Skoda had been doing this back in the early 1900s with their modular platform for luxury cars. This ethos has been brought forward as the backbone of the VW Group today, with different platforms for different types of cars and more flexible platforms named modular component systems that sit across a few car segments each. So when you get 2 or 3 cars that all sit on the exact same platform, that procure their components from the same place and are all aimed at a similar part of the market, what do you get? 2 or 3 very similar cars, of course. My favourite example of this is the Seat Me, Skoda Citigo and VW Up, all of which sit on the PQ12 NSF platform for ultra-compact city cars, and all 3 are built in VW's Slovakian factory in Bratislava. They all had similar price points over the years until the Me Electric came out, and honestly, look at the 3 of them, they are almost identical. It's also worth noting that the engines are usually the same too, within the same offerings of cars from VW Group, but again, this makes sense as it's cheaper for the group to make a whole bunch of the same engine with the same components, and it's therefore easier to get parts to fix them as well. Plus, if you're building a Super Mini for example, it's unlikely Seat are going to want to put a V8 block in there, while Skoda put a 1 litre inline 4 turbo in it, so it just makes sense to share the same parts on that front. However, from my experience of VW Group cars, there are usually some fundamental differences between cars from the different brands. Just like there's a huge difference between the Bentley Continental Flying Spur and the VW Phaeton, despite sharing the same platform and basic engine block, although obviously the Bentley gets the 2 turbos attached. I can only speak on the generations that I've driven in particular, but feel free to add to my points if you have any further insights. If you're going for an early 2000s VW Group car, VW and Audi tend to feel the most well put together. VWs feel relatively simple on the interior, but well equipped for their age, while Audis have quite modern interiors for their time, with a slightly more sporty or premium focus. The Seats I've driven from the early 2000s felt the cheapest of the bunch in terms of materials and design, while Skodas are super basic, almost direct copies of their VW equivalents but with fewer amenities. When you jump ahead to cars from the late 2010s and early 2020s by comparison, it's a different story. Seats feel more premium than they did before, and I like the more aggressive styling they get on both the exteriors and interiors, with some different colour choices available too. VWs have the same sort of solid feel to them, which is nice and consistent with the brand, though I would mention that compared to Seat and Skoda, they don't feel particularly more premium like they used to. Modern Skodas, I would suggest, are the best value for money, as the Skoda Simply Clever initiative means their leadership teams have really gone all out on making cars that are ultra practical for drivers and passengers. They have better specs than they used to as well, pretty much on par with Seat and VW. Modern Audis feel a step above the rest, particularly when you get onto S-Line trims and above. S-Line models can really get some nice premium materials and features that definitely raise the cars to a different pedestal, but anything lower kinda feels more like a premium VW. From a driving point of view, they all had a similarish feel, particularly jumping between cars on the same platform from the same generation. My Polo and my Fabia, for example, handled almost identically, just that the Fabia had more body roll as an estate. I'm also always surprised at how similar they feel between generations. I've driven Polos from 2002 all the way through to the most recent generation, and somehow they actually remind me of each other. Now I might be hugely off here from your perspective, as this is my personal personal experience of these cars, and it's worth noting that I've not driven all of the offerings from the VW Group manufacturers, but this is relevant to the super mini, compact and mid-size segment of cars that I have experienced. I think there are two things that are important to remember when looking at multiple VW Group cars as something you're interested in buying. Firstly, which do you like most, whether it's aesthetically or in terms of how it drives or just how practical it is. Make sure you choose based on what you like most and can afford. Secondly, test drive one of each in the same class and see what you like and dislike about them, making sure you try a bit of everything like the infotainment, the boot and the in-cabin storage. Hopefully by knowing what I've spoken about in this video, you'll be better informed next time you're looking at buying either a Polo, Fabia or Ibiza for example. If you enjoyed this video, do hit the like button, I'd really appreciate it, and subscribe as well if you're new. Massive thanks to the patrons as always for their support, and to you guys as well for watching. I'll see you in the next one.
Listen.